When Daisy first told the others her plan, Bert refused to be part of it. "Protect that monster? I won't," he said. "I took a vow to kill it, Daisy. The Ickabog murdered my father." "Bert, it didn't," said Daisy. "It's never killed anyone. Please listen to what I've got to say." So that night in the cave, Bert, Martha and Roderick drew close to the Ickabog for the first time, always having been too scared before, and it told the 4 humans the story of the night years before, when it had come face to face with a man in the fog. "With yellow face hair," said the Ickabog, pointing at its own upper lip. "Moustaches," suggested Daisy, "and a twinkly sword." "Jewels," said Daisy. "It must have been the king." "Who else did you meet?" asked Bert. "Nobody," said the Ickabog. "I ran away and hid behind a boulder. Men killed all my ancestors. I was afraid." "Well, then how did my father die?" demanded Bert. "Was your Icka the one who was shot by the big gun?" asked the Ickabog. "Shot?" repeated Bert. "How do you know this if you'd run away?" "I was looking out from behind the boulder," said the Ickabog. "Ickabogs can see well in the fog. I was frightened and I wanted to see what the men were doing on the marsh. One man was shot by another man." "Flapoon!" burst out Roderick at last. He'd been afraid to tell Bert before now, but he couldn't hold it any longer. "Bert, I once heard my father tell my mother he owed his promotion to Lord Flapoon. I was really young. I didn't realise what he meant at the time. I'm sorry I never told you. I was afraid of what you'd say." Bert said nothing at all for several minutes. He was remembering that terrible night in the blue parlour when he'd found his father's cold, dead hand and pulled it from beneath the cornucopian flag for his mother to kiss. He remembered Spittleworth saying that they couldn't see his father's body, and he remembered Lord Flapoon spraying him and his mother with pie crumbs as he said how much he'd always liked Major Beamish. Bert put a hand to his chest where his father's medal lay close against his skin, turned to Daisy and said in a low voice, "All right, I'm with you." So the 4 humans and the Ickabog began to put Daisy's plan into operation, acting quickly because the snow was melting fast and they feared the return of the soldiers to the marshlands. First they took the enormous empty wooden platters that had borne the cheese, pies and pastries they'd already eaten, and Daisy carved words into them. Next the Ickabog helped the 2 boys pull the wagon out of the mud, while Martha collected as many mushrooms as she could find to keep the Ickabog well fed on the journey south. At dawn on the 3rd day they set out. They'd planned things very carefully. The Ickabog pulled the wagon, which was loaded up with the last of the frozen food and with baskets of mushrooms. In front of the Ickabog walked Bert and Roderick, who were each carrying a sign. Bert's read, "The Ickabog is harmless." Roderick said, "Spittleworth has lied to you." Daisy was riding on the Ickabog's shoulders. Her sign read, "The Ickabog eats only mushrooms." Martha rode in the wagon along with the food and a large bunch of snowdrops, which were part of Daisy's plan. Martha's sign read, "Up with the Ickabog, down with Lord Spittleworth." For many miles they met nobody, but as midday approached they came across 2 ragged people leading a single very thin sheep. This tired and hungry pair were none other than Hetty Hopkins, the maid, who'd given her children to Ma Grunter, and her husband. They'd been walking the country trying to find work, but nobody had any to give them. Finding the starving sheep in the road, they'd brought it along with them, but its wool was so thin and stringy it wasn't worth any money. When Mr. Hopkins saw the Ickabog, he fell to his knees in shock, while Hetty simply stood there with her mouth hanging open. When the strange party came close enough and the husband and wife were able to read the signs, they thought they must have gone mad. Daisy called down to them, "You aren't dreaming. This is the Ickabog, and it's kind and peaceful. It's never killed anyone. In fact, it's saved our lives." The Ickabog bent down carefully so that it wouldn't dislodge Daisy and patted the thin sheep on the head. Instead of running away, it baaed, quite unafraid, and then returned to eating the dry, thin grass. "You see," said Daisy, "your sheep knows it's harmless. Come with us. You can ride on the wagon." The Hopkinses were so tired and hungry that even though they were still very scared of the Ickabog, they heaved themselves up beside Martha, bringing their sheep too. Then off trundled the Ickabog, the 6 humans and the sheep, heading for Jeroboam. Dusk was falling as the dark grey outline of Jeroboam came into view. The Ickabog's party made a brief stop on a hill overlooking the city. Martha handed the Ickabog the big bunch of snowdrops. Then everyone made sure they were holding their signs the right way up and the four friends shook hands because they'd sworn to each other and to the Ickabog that they would protect it and never stand aside, even if people threatened them. So down the hill towards the city the Ickabog marched, and the guards at the city gates saw it coming. They raised their guns to fire, but Daisy stood up on the Ickabog's shoulder, waving her arms, and Bert and Roderick held their signs aloft. Rifles shaking, the guards watched fearfully as the monster walked closer and closer. "The Ickabog has never killed anyone," shouted Daisy. "You've been told lies," shouted Bert. The guards didn't know what to do, because they didn't want to shoot four young people. The Ickabog shuffled ever closer, and its size and strangeness were both terrifying, but it had a kindly look in its enormous eyes and was holding snowdrops in its paw. At last, reaching the guards, the Ickabog came to a halt, bent down, and offered each of them a snowdrop. The guards took the flowers because they were afraid not to. Then the Ickabog patted each of them gently on the head, as it had done to the sheep, and walked on into Jeroboam. There were screams on every side. People fled before the Ickabog or dived to find weapons, but Bert and Roderick marched resolutely in front of it, holding up their signs, and the Ickabog continued to offer snowdrops to passers-by, until at last a young woman bravely took one. The Ickabog was so delighted it thanked her in its booming voice, which made more people scream, but others edged closer to the Ickabog, and soon a little crowd of people was clustered around the monster, taking snowdrops from its paw and laughing. And the Ickabog was starting to smile too. It had never expected to be cheered or thanked by people. "I told you they'd love you if they knew you," Daisy whispered in the Ickabog's ear. "Come with us," shouted Bert to the crowd. "We're marching south to see the king." And now the Jeroboamers, who'd suffered so much under Spittleworth's rule, ran back to their houses to fetch torches, pitchforks and guns, not to harm the Ickabog, but to protect it. Furious at the lies they'd been told, they clustered around the monster, and off they marched through the gathering darkness with only one short detour. Daisy insisted on stopping at the orphanage. Though the door was of course firmly locked and bolted, a kick from the Ickabog soon put that right. The Ickabog helped Daisy gently down, and she ran inside to fetch all the children. The little ones scrambled up onto the wagon. The Hopkins twins fell into the arms of their parents, and the larger children joined the crowd, while Ma Grunter screamed and stormed and tried to call them back. Then she saw the Ickabog's huge hairy face squinting at her through a window, and I'm happy to tell you she passed out cold on the floor. Then the delighted Ickabog continued down the main street of Jeroboam, collecting more and more people as it went, and nobody noticed Basher John watching from a corner as the crowd passed. Basher John hadn't forgotten the nose punch he'd received from Roderick Roach the night before the two boys stole his keys. He realised at once that if these troublemakers with their overgrown marsh monster reached the capital, anybody who'd made pots of gold from the myth of the dangerous Ickabog would be in trouble. So instead of returning to the orphanage, Basher John stole another drinker's horse from outside the tavern. Unlike the Ickabog, which was moving slowly, Basher John was soon galloping south to warn Lord Spittleworth of the danger marching on Shoeville.